get us started with our third day in Diversity Week. Before getting us kicked off, I'd like to ask everyone to please be reminded that we are in God's holy presence. Today's diversity dialogue is going to be facilitated by Dr. Christy Billups, a longstanding and committed member of Lewis's community. Dr. Billups, as many of you know, is an assistant professor of theology, the director of the Grow Institute, and co-director of the Peace Studies program. And Christy, in all of those titles, if I got anything wrong, make sure you correct me, okay?
You're doing fine.
Aside from her work in the mentioned programs and our project, she serves in really a variety of capacities across our institution, and I'm grateful that she accepted my invitation to talk about Just Mercy. I am Christy Kelly, Dr. Christy Kelly, Lewis's Chief Diversity Officer and Director of Multicultural Student Services. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and on behalf of Dr. Dave Livingston, Lewis's president, your presence is welcome, and we truly appreciate you being with us this afternoon. When Christy and I started to prepare for today, and it happened many months back, so our initial plan was to simply screen the movie Just Mercy. But of course, in light of the circumstances and our pandemic, and we continue to pray for good health and wellness for all, we inevitably transitioned to hosting, of course, the online forum, inspired not only by the movie, which has characters in it, but also the text, Just Mercy, the book that Bryan wrote, and what I would call Attorney Stevenson's his calling. And so if you're familiar with the book and movie, thank you for engaging in thought with us today. And if you're not familiar with the book or the movie and haven't had an opportunity to read or see it, I truly encourage you to look into at least one of those platforms. So housekeeping rules or housekeeping items, we are in record mode. The recording will be made available on our institution's YouTube channel with closed captioning. If you would, please stay in mute for the most part. And if you have a question or comment, use the chat box for your input. And Christy and I will be sure to address the questions or comments at the conclusion of her talk with us today. So bear with me. Again, I'm going to switch over to Christy so that she can engage us in this dialogue this afternoon.
Thanks, Christy.
No problem. All right, Christy, should be all good now.
All right. So thanks for the introduction, and thanks everybody for joining me and joining us, and really marking this really important week of every year in at Lewis, of making sure that we're raising consciousness about a variety of realities and communities that we want to continue to work toward greater justice, greater equity, greater compassion. What most people are not braving the share their screen, but or their live screen. I was kind of curious before I started how many people had seen the movie, but I'm not sure if there's a good way to figure that out.
Christy, there is.
Yes.
So each participant has a feature that looks like you can clap your hands. So it's under reactions. So if folks can look on their taskbar, there should be a reaction button that looks like an emoji, if you will, and there's a thumbs up or there's a clap. So I would call the clap raise your hand.
Yeah, so if, so Dave Livingston has either seen the book or, read the book or seen the movie. Obviously Christy has. Anybody else? Fred, great. So I'm gonna go with the guess that, thanks, Stephanie. And just Nicole, Joey, and Sarah, I see you, so I've marked your names down there in my class. Great. So thanks, Stephanie. Yeah. So I'm just gonna launch into some slides and share with you some thoughts about Bryan, Stevenson, and Just Mercy, but I feel like we're going to need to go back. We're going to need to really honor the legacies that led to what we're facing with mass incarceration and the racism and classism that are baked into our current reality with mass incarceration. And this is something, as Christy alluded, that Bryan Stevenson's vocation has been to confront all these injustices. And he's got an amazing tenacity is the word I would use, resilience and tenacity. He's been shot down any number of times for his views and for his stance, and yet he keeps on going. And so here you see a picture of him, and then it's a screenshot of the movie where Michael B. Jordan plays Bryan in the movie. I'm going to refer Attorney Stevenson, but I'll be familiar. And then Jamie Foxx plays one of the many men that he has worked with, particularly who were on death row, and some still are, and I'm going to touch on that. The movie and Bryan's work are centered in Alabama, which has some added issues, shall we say, as far as injustices around mass incarceration. So let me say this before we get into it. And I don't want to do tons and tons of talking, but I just feel like there's some frames I need to put in here to have a decent conversation. And I love the idea of the Sankofa bird. And I'll just because it's there when we're all trying to read while you're listening. The Sankofa bird reminds us that we must continue to move forward as we remember our past. And at the same time, we plant a seed for the future generations that come after us. And so that's what I propose to do. I want to go back and talk about where mass incarceration has evolved from. And I'm sure I'm going to miss key points because this is a relatively brief session. Every slide I show could probably be developed into an entire course. And let me say here that some of the slides are uncomfortable to see. Not that they'll be completely unfamiliar to some of you, but we have to face really hard truths if we're going to move forward in a proactive way. And that's where I'll conclude my comments, is talking about some of Bryan's wisdom around how we move from where we are to where we hope to be. So I really like this Sankofa bird and the fact that that seed, the bird is looking back, but planting a seed so that we can move forward. So if you look at anything from the Equal Justice Initiative that Bryan Stevenson has shaped, it always goes back to the legacy of slavery and the role that has played in shaping our mental formations around race in our country. And I thought, just a few numbers to remind us of the horrific journey that African and African American people have been on in our nation since before its inception. And in those 250 years, give or take 350, excuse me, 12.5 million people were brought to this continent from their home in Africa, and 26% of those shipped here, so to speak, were children. The official institution of slavery started in 1619 and supposedly ended in 1863. And I'm going to use this phrase that you'll see at the bottom of the slide, that just because something is made legal or illegal doesn't mean that justice happens right away, or even sometimes, unfortunately, at all. So in other words, just because the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1863, slavery and its variations carried on for an unfortunately very long time. In 1808, they legislation again banned the importation of slaves. But if you look at the top again, 1866 was when the last person was brought over on these horrific ships. And so just because it was banned doesn't mean it stopped happening. Once the importation slowed, of course, the slave industry continued to grow because of, obviously, slaves and slave owners insisting on many children from slaves. Another movie you'll want to watch if you haven't, and it's getting a little older now, but 12 Years a Slave really is an eye-opener as well, and just the horrific sexual assaults that were frequented on women in slavery, and men to some degree as well. So just that growth of slavery did not stop with the so-called ban on importing slaves from the continent of Africa. 3.9 million out of 4.4 in the US were slaves by 1860 as the Civil War approached. And just for the sake of conversation, the state of Virginia was the one that had the highest number of slaves, with almost 500,000 people who were chained. So again, legislation does not equal justice. I want to point the upper right-hand picture that hopefully you can see is obviously a pictorial, a drawing of what it would have been like to be on the slave ships. Horrible crowding and terribly injured conditions. Many, many, many people died crossing the Atlantic. And then I'm going to come back to this, but the sculpture that you see of this picture of a man and a woman and the woman's child being shackled and sold into slavery is one of the sculptures at the Legacy Museum in Alabama that has been a creation of the Equal Justice Initiative with Bryan Stevenson's leadership. More on that in a minute. So again, that unrealized legislation and the fact that it kept taking different forms, right? So when slavery ended legislatively, of course, very soon after, Jim Crow laws of segregation came in, and the 13th Amendment allowed that someone could still be used as a slave if they broke the law. And so we have this horrible legacy of the chain gangs and the leased prisoners, so that the plantation owners could continue to use and abuse, and in some ways purchase in a different way, the labor of Black people in particular. In 1882, a horrible spate of lynchings started, and I'm going to show a picture that's disturbing. I didn't want it to just jump out at you without warning, but this is one of the many pictures that we have of the horrible carnival type atmosphere that took place at the so-called events of the lynching of Black people. And so often their so-called crimes were, you know, looking at a white woman in the wrong way, or, you know, somehow being conceived as disrespectful, or other, you know, not crimes at all, and justification to lynch. In those years, 4,743 lynchings took place that we know of. Very important that many lynchings were not recorded. And of those 73%, so fully 3/4 of those who were lynched were Black. The rest were seen as sympathetic to the Black community and Black persons, or who might have stood up or said views that were not acceptable to the white supremacists of those years. And then the segregation, again, legislation doesn't equal justice. Plessy v. Ferguson legalized segregation in 1896, stating that it was separate but equal, which most of us are fully familiar with the fact that there was nothing equal about it. The civil rights movement eventually started to really confront, and certainly there were many movements and resistance long before that, but really took it to the streets in meaningful and powerful ways that started to reshape the relationship with race in this nation. Still, we have much work to do, but one of the things that started to shift things was Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, which helped to establish desegregation and hopefully integration. But again, many, particularly the southern states, but many states were very resistant to integration and desegregation. I just grabbed a couple of charts. You know, there's a million. If you did any research at all, you'd find any number of numbers to show the incredible racial disparities as we move into the conversation around incarceration specifically, as an ongoing way that Black persons in particular, but all people of color, are oppressed through the unjust application of laws and sentencing. And again, there are many intersections here with those who also do not have resources. But as you look at the chart on the left, it talks about the fact that Black men are sometimes more likely to be incarcerated than white men. And what I want to point out is our nation, like as a whole, 12.6% of people in our country are Black, but here that over a third of the people who are incarcerated, 3 times as many as would be representative of the general population, are incarcerated. And the racial disparities are also clearly evident on the right. And just FYI, the fastest growing population in the US is women, and certainly Black women, unfortunately, are in the highest numbers there as well. So again, so I'm kind of doing up to now and like narrowing circles, if you will, of what we're talking about, because it has not been his only work, but Bryan Stevenson has worked heavily with people on death row in Alabama in particular, but across the US on legislation to try to confront inequities and injustices within the system. Here you see the chart that's already up is the fact that, so as you might guess, well, you might not. So the brownish orange color there, that represents white people. And then the navy blue represents Black people. So the defendants, so again, really disproportionately heavy that Black people end up on death row or recipients of the death penalty. So these are people that have been executed. And I'm going to get more specific on numbers. So it's 1,514 if you add all those numbers on the left together. Sorry for the pause. And then the execution by race of victims, it is the 3/4 there is white victims. And so someone is far more likely to receive the death penalty if their victim is white. And then to get specific about Alabama, for those of you unfamiliar, there was a brief moment in the 70s, about 3 or 4 years, when there was not a death penalty in the United States. Unfortunately, in my opinion, it was reinstated in 1976 and continues today, and I'll say more about this in a second. In Alabama alone, there have been 67 executions. Just in case you're curious, the state most likely to execute someone by far and away is Texas. They've executed over 500 people in that same period of time. In Alabama, if you watched the movie or read the book, you know that electric chair is something that they used until not terribly long ago, and lethal injection, which, this is what I mean, every slide, there's so many like layers to this, but lethal injection has become, everybody sees it as more humane, but because the drugs or so-called cocktails of drugs used have not provided painless and speedy deaths as they were originally intended to do, it has become inhumane. And if you have questions about that, we can go back to it. But anyway, those are the two forms of execution. During all that time, 6 people that were on death row were proven wrongfully convicted. So in other words, there for something that they did not even do, and 1 clemency granted by the governor. When it names those who were proven innocent, 2 at least were represented by Bryan Stevenson and achieved those wrongful convictions. Those 2 were featured in the film. One was Walter McMillan, who was in that original picture, portrayed by Jamie Foxx, and another one, Anthony Ray Hinton. If you saw the film, he was in the cell next to Walter or Johnny D, as they called him, and he also was served like 30 years and eventually was proven innocent of why he was on death row. In Alabama, only 175 people are currently on death row, and that includes 5 women. So what, when Bryan was not originally from Alabama, but he did an internship. He was there from a very similar community in the Southeast, and he moved to Alabama because he did an internship there and realized the level of injustice and the inequities that African-American persons were facing, particularly on death row. And so he chose to establish something early on called the Equal Justice Initiative. And originally it was 2 or 3 people doing their best to wade through the incredibly heavy load of trying to defend someone who is convicted of a capital crime. It's an incredible amount of work. And they just kept slogging away. And so here you see today the Equal Justice Initiative and the staff that supports it. So he's grown an amazing group of people to stand up for people's rights and justice. And then something they've recently created is what they call the Legacy Museum. And it's more than this. It's that sculpture I showed you toward the beginning of the woman and man being sold into slavery. And here you see a memorial to the lynching victims. And if you look closely, you know, there's people beneath them, so you can get the enormity of the sculpture. I guess you could say it's a huge sculpture of reminding us with names, and you know, there's multiple names on every hanging item in that sculpture, and just really waking people up to the terror of being someone who had Black skin and lived in the southeast of our nation in particular, although it wasn't exclusively there. I know they also have a very beautiful project there where they invite people to take a jar and go to a site where there was a lynching and to collect the soil that would have been beneath where the lynching took place, to honor that soil, the blood that seeped into that soil, and then they bring the soil back to the Legacy Museum, and there are jars that display that. So that's really powerful too. So when Bryan speaks, I've seen him in person, and I know this is an ongoing narrative that he shares with people, and he brings up these points. So in the face of this horrific mass incarceration, I didn't say the usual that, we're 2.1 million people. The US is by far the largest incarcerator on the planet. And one of very few countries that still holds the death penalty as a method of response to crime. And so he is attempting to inspire others to join him in this work for justice, which we must do. He cannot do it alone, and has not done it alone, to be fair. But his wisdom is this, that we need to get proximate. That's the word he always uses. And it's that idea of coming up close to other people and really deeply listening to the stories that they share and the perspectives that they have, so that we can build bridges and really understand if it's not our narrative, or we don't know people that we're close to that it's their narrative. We need to understand the journey people have been on. And then we need to start changing that narrative, that the narrative that some races are superior to others, or more likely to be guilty than others, or this ideology that mass incarceration is the only way to keep our communities safe, which in fact, it contributes incredibly little to that goal. The narratives of bigotry, and the narratives of, if a young child is born, particularly if it's a boy and he's Black, that the pathway is most clearly going to be to prison or some other really sad ending. And we have to change that narrative, the presumption of guilt of people of color. So we need to get up close and really deeply listen. We need to change the narrative. And then we need, against all odds, to stay hopeful. I know sometimes when I speak to people who have not yet thought through the idea that prisons are not the answer, certainly not the only answer, but not even the best answer, that they'll say, well, that's how we do things. That's how else are we going to do it? And I would hold that there was a day in our history, many hundreds of years in our history, where we thought slavery was just a given, right? That it's how we do things. It's how else are we going to get our cotton? How else are we going to, run our plantations? But we came to understand the enormity of the inhumanity of that institution. And so those of us who understand that there are many better means to confront crime and help hold accountable those who get involved in crime, that we have to stay hopeful that there's a way to change and reform and restructure. And in order to stay hopeful and to get proximate and change the narrative, we're going to have to take the risk that sometimes we need to be uncomfortable. And certainly sometimes we need to be vulnerable. We need to own that we don't get it sometimes, or we need to take risks with our lives and our stance and for standing up for something that we believe in, even if others may disagree, may respond in aggressive ways to us, that we have to take that risk in order to move the needle on greater justice and confronting racism specifically. So what I want to do, and I feel like I really kind of want to hear first what some of your reactions or something you feel like, again, this is so many big topics that I'm throwing into a short space of time. But the best way for this time to be fruitful for all of us, in my opinion, is to interact with each other. And I can come back to these, but these were some possible things we could talk about. The intersection of class and race, some of the other things I mentioned as I went through the slides, how our values and what our convictions inform what we need to do with our bodies, and how that's speaking to our hearts. Maybe speaking a little bit more about the power and the beauty of mercy, and then exploring our own calls of what we feel like we're being invited to as individuals and as part of a greater human community. So I'm going to stop sharing, which means these questions will go away, but they don't have to be the only questions we ask. I would love just to hear reactions, thoughts, feelings, something when you watched the movie that stood out for you, or read the book, or anything I might have said that triggered something for you. Or you can send a chat, and Christy's going to be watching the chats.
So James, give me just a second, and I'm gonna get back to the chat and see what's in there. Okay. All right. So everyone should be able to unmute themselves. So James, go ahead and feel free to make your comment.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Billups, for presenting that. That was very good information. Unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to see or read about Just Mercy, but I would love to comment on the last bullet as far as what our individual calling may be for our community. Me growing up, I've always heard that, specifically Black men will be thrown in jail by the time I was like 25 or 21. My cousins will always, say that story, or even my mother would bring it up to me as well. She was a single parent, raising 6 kids on her own, specifically 2 boys, myself included, and my older brother that she had to help raise. And that was always kind of the push behind her being so tough on her boys, is to make sure that we didn't end up in those circumstances. So growing up with that in mind, I also have 6 nephews now that my brother and I try to kind of let them know the history, the Sankofa. I'm glad that you brought that up as well, to let them be more aware of what the future has for them, but don't forget about the past and what the perception of African Americans, specifically men, are in America. How I do that as well in a professional way is to, I've been blessed with opportunities to work at Lewis University, specifically be a part of the multicultural student services department. And I always keep that in mind as well, is to make sure that all of the, specifically men of color that I advise, is to let them know, how important they are, and remind them of somewhat of the history that America, right, has presented to us. So I feel like in the professional world, I'm definitely in the right position to give back to my community, of course, I advise all students that come, by the department, but in my line of work, just to advise, those people as well. And outside of professional, is to make sure that I'm setting a good example, and it starts at home, really. And that's the reason why I bring up my nephews, because I always want to instill in them that, they could do anything they could put their mind to, but be aware of the past to make sure that it's a better future.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah. And I'll just, and I don't need to comment on everybody, but like, I just think that mentoring is such a powerful, method of interrupting that narrative, and just such a powerful alternative if we would dump some resources in our communities into supporting particularly men who would choose this role and who feel called to that, that it would just make such a huge difference. And so rather than investing in prison buildings, we need to do better. So thanks so much, James.
I don't see anything in the chat box per se, so I'm going to cheat a little bit. When Christy and I have talked about, again, preparing for not only today, because this is one of many days in which we talk about, I'm going to call it conviction in our hearts, and having grace for one another. And again, selfishly, so with positionalities, I can't even say that it's just African-American men, because if you look back at that data and those numbers, it's I won't say any and all, but Black women are also targeted, and probably more so than Black men. It's just not as
not in the same numbers, but in horrible percentages. Yeah,
exactly. So I think I preface, I went into wanting to talk about just mercy and conviction and grace, just knowing that there is hope in the work that we're trying to do, and that each of us have a responsibility and the capability, if we're just willing to engage. And I know this sounds cliche, in a dialogue, right? And sometimes it's not even sometimes, it is very uncomfortable, but the willingness to want to do it is what resonates for me. And I can respect a person who wants to, as opposed to somebody who's more resistant. So so that's my little cheat, because I actually shared that with Christy as we talk about these issues and so forth. Go ahead, Christy. I saw your face.
Yeah, no, and this is where, like, you just raise your hand and I will press the pause button on my own talking, because my students know I could go on for a while, especially on this topic. But I think that intersects what you just said, Christy, with this, narrative of hope, right? Like, how do we keep hope moving, of that we can confront and reform and transform? And I think it's recognizing that we're not called to do it alone. And we had a very real hope of having an event in March before, it was supposed to be on the 23rd. You all know what we were doing on the 23rd of March. And it was going to be looking at how we can make restorative justice a way of seeing and doing things in Will County. There are a number of emerging resources, I'll say, in Chicago of this nature, but certainly some of the same realities around our communities, around Lewis, around Joliet, throughout Will County. And how do we, do some of the mentoring, or do some of the changing the narrative through sitting in, restorative circles, or, providing alternative activities and community efforts for our young people, so that we interrupt the pipelines that are so troubling. And so we were gonna come together with some people who are already doing it in Chicago and say, let's imagine, let's be creative about how this could again, interrupt the narrative we're on. And I think the thing we haven't even mentioned, if I may, if it's not too much jumping around, but is in our prisons right now throughout the country, but certainly in Illinois, this that we're all enduring as free people is compounded exponentially when you're incarcerated, and the virus, like, you don't have the cleaning supplies, you don't have the the hand sanitizer, you cannot distance yourself from a cellie that shares a 6x9 cell with you, or from the officers who bring your food and may or may not use gloves or masks, or or if you feel ill, you may or may not be taken seriously and get the health care you need. And there's just so much that's not okay about what's happening right now to people who are locked up. So I just sort of raise that as a very real, very current, not necessarily race specific, although certainly in the broader community, it's overly impacting the African-American community yet again. So I just throw that out as something else that I think needs to be in our consciousness, and need to be looking at ways we can try to confront these issues. I know there's thoughts and opinions out there in this group that's here, so don't be shy.
Nothing showing up in chat yet.
So I could send my 3 students who are on this with no extra credit if they don't chime in.
Uh-oh.
I'm mean like that. Well, what I'm going to do, so this is what I do with my classes sometimes, and you can pass if you don't want to, but let me just sort of ask you this. Like, you showed up today. Now, maybe that's because you're like part of the Multicultural Student Services office and you felt like you should because it's supportive. But is there something in this narrative and in what Bryan Stevenson is inviting us to that is calling you? And I think, and again, you can pass, but why don't we just let me toss it to each person, and I'd love to invite you to share a little bit of what it's evoking in you or what it's calling from you. And Brianna, if you wouldn't mind, you're in my upper corner, so would you mind would you start?
I think that it kind of calls to me because, I'm in like a social work stance. So for the past year, I was at a middle school and a high school, and I kind of saw how differently our Black students, especially the Black male students, are treated a little. They got in more trouble for small things, like being disruptive in class, where some students they were like, oh, it's fine. However, they get sent directly to the social work officers or the principal's office, which it kind of like, I don't know how to word it, but it sets a standard for them. So like when they get older, that same standard kind of follows them. They get in trouble more for whatever it is they do. It doesn't just start once they become like a man, like older, when they're in their 30s and 40s. It starts when they're like 7 and 9 and 12.
Yep. Do you feel called to, I mean, you're in a perfect position, right? Like, how are you feeling called to interrupt that pattern that we're in?
The thing I liked about the school district that I was in was that they are good about talking to the teacher and the student together. So I would take the opportunity to bring the teacher and the student together so that the teacher can see like that, not that they're wrong, but that they are punishing these students harder than they will punish someone else, And when I do begin my professional career as a social worker, I hope to continue to do that and to help people understand their own biases so that these children don't suffer because of it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of, Sarah, would you be willing to share?
Yeah, I just connected what I heard from you guys into my pen pals, and one of mine said that he thinks that we all need to start changing on the whole, on how we all see like black men as they're automatically like dangerous and harmful. And he said that it's hard to change like a society's mind. And I thought that Stevenson is trying to show that to everyone, how we all need to get out of this mindset that people of color are automatically more like harmful or violent, and like they're not. And Arthur said that from the inside it's the same, how the guards treat the prisoners of color automatically more harsh and aggressive than the white prisoners, which I think is horrible because they're all there because of a crime. It's not like one is more innocent than the other. So I thought that was interesting.
Maybe just really quickly, Sarah, before you turn your mic back off, like not everybody knows what, like with the pen pal thing, what you're talking about. So can you tell them what you're talking about?
Oh, yeah. So with our class, we are assigned these, I don't want to say like inmates, but prisoners who are incarcerated, and we write to them every week, and we just learn more about like their lives. And like I talk to mine about what we're learning in class and the readings we read and like what we watch and stuff. And I've learned a lot from talking to them and like just their views on what we talk about, but on the inside, which is cool.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And Sarah also brings up, that differential treatment inside that this really comes out in Just Mercy too, but that a lot of our prisons were built in rural and southern Illinois, and at the risk of generalizing, unfortunately, there are officers that bring white supremacist views into their work in the prisons. And so that really shows up in treatment of people.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks, Sarah. Dorothy, I don't know if you want to weigh in, hon, or not, or it's up to you. You're muted, just so you know.
Hi, I'm going to pass on this, but I am just learning all the different, just coming to this department and really having an open eye, and just seeing, sometimes you don't know what's going out there, and you learn so much from so many people. Having this opportunity has been really, really good.
And you know what you're doing, Dorothy, is you're proximate in ways that perhaps you were not previously.
Right.
It's huge. Mm-hmm.
So
thank you so much.
I'm grateful for, for that.
Yeah. We are too. Thank you. Mary, you feel like chiming in?
No, I was waiting for the students too, to be honest. I grew up in the South. I think some of you know that. So I am always amazed at how, even from up here versus the South, how the treatment really has not changed very much, and it's kind of sad. Brianna talked about the education system. I feel that is still very prevalent, especially in the South. But being in education, I feel very passionate about helping students just to learn how to help themselves be successful. I just feel that's a big part of that. And the incarceration, I don't know, it's really going to take a lot, I think, to make a difference, but I think education is the way to do that, and helping families and helping students, as Brianna pointed out, at a very young age to come through the process. And just help them along the way with guides and mentors and role models, which I think is very significant and needed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much. And since you're all here, I'm just calling on everybody. So sorry, I didn't mean to take you off guard, but Classy, you want to jump in, or would you prefer to pass?
Hello, everyone. I'll jump in.
Great.
When I saw the diversity and inclusion email, I've wanted to attend many events, but did not have the opportunity, due to scheduling, and I'm multitasking now. Being able to attend is great. What drew me to this Zoom conversation is because I am the mother of 2 sons, Black sons, also the aunt of a Black male who is incarcerated, and I am his stand-in mother because my sister passed away. So I'm not going to get emotional. I am the one who has to visit him, and has to take care of him, and to hear his stories of injustice, not being able to get his letters to us or phone calls to his lawyer, because he feels like every time he wants to reach out, he gets punished, or something comes up where he didn't do something, so he's placed in the hole. And being placed in the hole can last you for months. He's not getting the health care that he needs. He needs to see a dentist, and he hasn't seen one since he's been in there, which is approximately maybe 6 or 7 years. And to hear his letters, to hear him on the phone when I can get to him, to hear about that tooth rotting, those kind of stories that people don't hear about. And, and a lot of people don't know that I have a nephew who is incarcerated, and to hear people say, well, that's what they get for, the crime. But a lot of times that crime, just like Just Mercy, you're not sure. He could have been wrongly convicted, which we really truly believe. But then to hear how he's being treated inside is horrible. It's very horrible. And as Mary DeGraw said, even though the way Blacks were treated, so many years ago, some of it hasn't changed much. There's times where I just finished reading the book called The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
And I'm listening to this story, and I'm like, nothing has changed. I am telling my sons the same things that these mothers were telling their sons as they're moving, the Great Migration from the South to the North. I live in Joliet, and there were times where I'd had to tell my sons, well, if you go into Wilmington or if you go into Minooka, when you go out at a certain time, beware of this and beware of that. Or, my husband came home late one night. Well, not late. He comes home in the morning from his shift, and it's at like 6 a.m, and it was dark during that time. So they had to be probably October, November. And he gets pulled over by the police right in front of our house. And the officer says, where are you going, sir? And my husband says, home. And he's like, where's home? He's like, right here. I live right here. And those are the type of things. And, some of your peers, they don't understand that. And those are hard things to get across to people unless you're living it.
Absolutely.
So this is what drew me to this conversation.
Which prison is he in, Classy?
He's in Menard.
Oh, ugh.
Yeah.
I've been there too many times. Oh my gosh.
It's no fun.
No. And that's exactly one of the places where I've heard the worst stories about the officers and their affiliations, shall we say.
Yes, he has mentioned that before, but there's nothing that they can do. And he says, I'm trying to do everything I can, TT, to get out of here. I'm on my best behavior. I'm doing this, this, and that. And he says, every opportunity that comes where I can see my lawyer, I've done something wrong. And he says, I haven't done anything wrong, but they said I've done something wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. Classy, thank you so much for being willing to share that vulnerable space in your life. And
Thank you.
our prayers are with your nephew. And you.
And I don't mean to be the task horse.
I was just looking at the time as well, but
And I want to make sure, Christy, your students who are online, our students who are online, have an opportunity to share thoughts if they haven't already.
sounds good.
And Brianna through chat has shared with me, I won't say a resource, but a documentary that she is familiar with, and I've heard about, and I think I've actually watched. So if the students have anything to share, I'd like to give them an opportunity before we not run out of time, but our time.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. So Joey, would you want to chime in, hon, or what are you feeling?
Hi.
Hey, Joe.
Yeah, so I didn't read or watch Just Mercy, but just some things that my pen pal Cliff and I talk about. One of the things that really stuck out was just how he's white, and like some of the guards who are also white will kind of like, you know, the guard will belittle, you know, people of color or Hispanics, and then kind of like make a joke to Cliff just because he's white. And like, it's just so crazy that, you know, even in prison, like he has that advantage of, you know, not receiving certain like
The
worse
treatment.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so, you know, just like the whole pen pal thing, like it just, I'm learning so much more than I would have, you know, and it's really crazy to hear about all this. I'm really happy, you know, I have the exposure to it so I can be more informed, and, you know, so yeah.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I'll pop down to Nicole.
Hi.
Hi.
This, like, not even just this sitting here and talking about this, but like the whole class that I've had with Dr. B has been super, super, super eye-opening. Like, for me, these were never conversations that I had growing up or like in school. Like, you learn about history and like slavery and all those things, but you don't talk about the things that are uncomfortable. And I think that's, a lot of people are scared of doing that, but I think normalizing talking and like bringing these conversations to light is like the first step to like change, just like evolving society to understand, like, if we don't have these conversations and we don't normalize these conversations, like, we're never going to get anywhere. And that's why things have been happening for the amount of time that they have. And learning like through my pen pal and really like exposing, you know, the uncomfortableness has been something like super, for me, like I'm very grateful for the conversations that I've had and like very eye-opening. So yeah.
Grateful for you too, Nicole, for all of you. One more, Dr. Kelly, if it's okay with you. Okay. Alex, I see you there, and you took, I don't even know what year you took Faith Behind Bars, but.
Yeah, so that was actually quite a bit ago, but right now I'm a grad student at Lewis for ESL. And I don't know, I kind of just connected it with like currently being a teacher. And I think like the idea of getting proximate, like a lot of issues arise within like even like staff, but like obviously students alone, just from like not listening or even like knowing anything about each other. So like I feel like a lot of that could be avoided, you know, by getting proximate. Like you might disagree, but like at least then you would value someone else's feelings.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Alex. Good to see your face, honey. So back to you, Dr. Kelly. I'll get out of the way.
No, first and foremost, thank you. I don't think I said thank you yet, Christy, or maybe I did, but thank you.
Yeah.
And
My pleasure.
thank you. And even more so, I really appreciate each of you. And I won't even call it being, put on the spot, if you will, but engaging literally in a dialogue. And for me, listening to capital L as opposed to a small L. Brianna, if you want to unmute yourself and share the documentary, Youth Behind.
Okay, so the documentary series is called Kids Behind Bars, Life of Parole. It's on A&E and all the episodes are also on Hulu. The one that stuck out that's related to the topic we were talking about is the second episode titled Curtis, where it was a situation where 5 young boys, 2 African-American, 3 white, were in a situation where 4 of the boys shot someone and killed them. However, the 5th one, Curtis, didn't have a gun, just met those kids that day. He was the only one sentenced to life. The other African-American was sentenced to 20 years, and the 3 white kids, one was sentenced to parole. The 13-year-old, they said he was too young for jail, was let go. And then I forgot what happened to the other one, but he was also let go. So only 2 of them actually did jail time. And since Curtis was 15, he was sentenced to life in prison for just being around some kids he just met.
I know I said I'd stop, but something really, really important that Bryan Stevenson did was in 2012 got legislation through the U.S. Supreme Court that juveniles will not be given life without parole, that has become unconstitutional. And of course, it's a state-by-state process getting that applied, but it overlaps.
That's kind of what the show is surrounded by, about the new law. So there's a lot of lawyers in the show going through each and every case to see like which kid, well, they're adults now, deserve like fair trial.
Thank you so much.
So I'll close us out really quickly as we're thinking about real life stories and experiences. If you also have time to check out Central Park 5, that too is a very telling story about the 5 young men in New York who are now men and were wrongfully convicted, not necessarily associated with Attorney Stevenson's work, but very much related to the topic. So 2 things I want to share before I say have a good night is that first and foremost, if nothing else, our institution is really trying. I know there's some, conversation to be had and a lot of work to be done, but I'm proud to share, and this is probably speaking too prematurely, but through the support of Dr. Livingston and Dr. Sant and my faculty colleagues, we have applied for a grant that addresses legacy of slavery in the United States. Hopeful to get it, but if we aren't granted the opportunity to get the monetary support, the work still happens. There are people on our campus who are dedicated to this thing called equity and justice. And Christy, I thank you 1,000,000 times over for your passion and commitment to peace and justice.
Thank you.
And so, and then lastly, as we continue to engage in what I like to say physical distancing, I know we social distancing, I get it, that we do so in solidarity. So
Absolutely.
Thank you very much for hanging with us for, it's now over an hour, sorry. And I'll get this posted on YouTube, so feel free to share it with folks that might find interest in what we talked about today.
And thank you for your leadership, Christy, in all this. We're very.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. You guys have a good night.
All right, you too. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Hope to see you soon.